Hi, I'm going to spend a few minutes giving some context to the pieces of Martin Luther King that I've had you read for this week. I termed this week the Radical King because these pieces really focus on King's political, economic, social ideas that are often seen as quite radical. Um, and that going off of the idea that we've talked about before, where radical is related to this Latin word radix, which is going to the root or the foundation of something, um, these pieces really show King trying to wrestle with, trying to hit at what are the roots, the root foundational problems that are sort of leading to the situation that he's wrestling with in his time, in his context, and he they're also sort of seen as radical in the more common sort of understanding of radical as surprising or shocking, or specifically in the political sense, radical as something which is sort of striking against the status quo in a very profound way. He is, with each of these pieces, hitting at another element of whether it's Christian culture, Christian theology, whether it's the Jim Crow segregation system of oppression, or whether it's talking about the reflecting his Christian concerns and his strong emphasis on nonviolence, looking at the militarism that's inherent, that he saw as inherent in the American society generally. These pieces really are looking at these things in a very challenging way, and in a way that many people at the time saw as incredibly controversial. Especially the a letter from Birmingham jail and A Time to Break Silence were both profoundly controversial, and created a significant amount of conflict and challenge for King and the wider group of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and sort of rippled out both for his work and impacted how he was able to do his work. And in many ways, The Time to Break Silence actually severely impacted his ability to do a great amount of work in many settings that were not comfortable or ready to address a more radical critique of militarism and of the racism and the oppression, and oftentimes the exploitation of poverty and of poor people that you see that military recruitment, particularly during the Vietnam War era, really is inherent in this kind of militaristic culture that he's really hitting at in these pieces. So anyway, I'm specifically looking at how these pieces highlight King's focus on power and on these root evils that he calls the three evils: racism, militarism, and poverty. Now, specifically relating to power, he's addressing not only the use of power, but who gets to use power, how the power is used, and to what ends is this power used. Now, each piece highlights a different context and a different time. Letter from Birmingham Jail is specifically addressing segregation and state police power in Birmingham, specifically in 1963. A Time to Break Silence is looking at the Cold War and the military and American militarism more broadly in 1967. And The Drum Major Instinct is wrestling with this question of importance and ego and power, and how that he makes a really interesting link to the question of ego and the need for importance and the root cause and rise of white supremacy in the drum major instinct. So the beauty of Martin Luther King's writing is that it's often rather pretty self-explanatory. He does not hit soaring rhetoric simply for the sake of soaring rhetoric. He makes his arguments really pretty clear. He is at core a preacher. That's where he sort of got his foundational rooting in his ministry. He was an academic. He did earn his doctorate, but that wasn't really what informed the way that he spoke and the way that he communicated. He would weave in these really interesting and really complex academic ideas that he gained from his graduate work, but in the end, he's still really trying to hit the notes of talking directly to a congregation. So he needs to be understandable to people who may not be literate, people who are possibly having coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. So he's got to hit as many people as he possibly can. So I don't really need to go into too much depth about the specifics of each of the arguments, but I do want to give a context and a framing to each of these pieces so you understand at some level why he's saying what he's saying in each of these pieces and what the impact is in the future, or at his time, and also the impact that it's made on the broader civil rights movement. So specifically starting with the letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. This is in the context of intense police violence led by the chief of police at the time, the chief of the Birmingham police, by a guy named Bull Connor, who is very well known. And if you've studied anything about the civil rights movement, you've heard his name before. He's very well known for being very insistent on a certain framework of policing, and that insists on order and insists on upholding segregation and upholding the segregation system. If you've ever seen pictures of, for example, police officers sicking dogs on protesters, or protesters being sort of just knocked down by fire hoses, there's a likelihood that this was happening in Birmingham, and it's a likelihood that it was Bull Connor who'd made those, who'd ordered those police officers to engage in that level of practice. It's also this letter from Birmingham jail is in the context of a significant escalation of violence against the black church in 1962 and 1963, where you see a number of the number of church burnings in Alabama especially, and the number of church bombings, specifically of black churches, rise. In 1963 is when you have the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, one of the most well-known and notorious of the bombings, because it led to the tragic deaths of 4 young black girls. And it became a bit of a cause célèbre at the time because of the fact that it was finally that one final sort of thing which sort of pushed this sort of terrorist attack on the black church into the national consciousness because of the fact that it was so heinous. These 4 young girls that were killed, and but I've spoken about this before in my lecture on the beloved community, but the bombing and the context of the bombing really points to something that is essential for you to understand in the letter from Birmingham jail, in that the the black church is seen as not only a practical rooting for the civil rights movement in its about 1955, 56 to like 1963, in this sort of this earlier time of the movement, is the black church is in many ways the place where the civil rights movement finds its greatest advocates, its strongest and most vocal workers, and it is rooted in a lot of this theological. The early civil rights movement is rooted in a lot of this theological language that is coming from this very specific context of the black church. So the church is the symbol of everything that is the white Southern power structure is trying to fight against in defending the Jim Crow segregation system. So bombing of a Black Baptist church is inherently going to be a symbolic move against the civil rights movement. So King is at this point in 1963 trying to balance a lot that's happening. The movement has shifted beyond just these set piece things where you have like a sit in here or a sit in here, or you'd have like a march here, or you'd have for example a bus boycott there. King is starting to slowly in 63 move the civil rights movement from just being about rights and legal movements, and again the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in around 63 to 65 is a good moment to kind of pause, for King to pause and reflect on, okay, now that we've passed these laws and policies, what is this wider movement? You can see slowly in his conversation around 63, it's starting to move out farther towards where King eventually moves from like 65 on to 68, where he starts talking about this much broader question of poverty, and much broader question of the entire structure of segregation, the entire structure of racism. It's where you see him start to move up into the north, start to move into Chicago and to California and some of these other areas, and saying, well, in noting that there needs to be movement in these cities as well. So the letter to the Birmingham jail is a key point where it's right at the end, where he starts to move away from just a Southern emphasis on Southern states and move farther out towards a much broader social movement. King is trying to balance these ideas as well as the rise of black nationalism and militarism, which is just starting around 63. Which is bubbling up and emerging at some level from King's own actions and King's insistence on, having the movement be exclusively nonviolent and having the movement be focused on specific kinds of actions and specific kinds of language. And as I, again, talked about in the last lecture, this insistence on being open to not compromising principles, but open to the fact that they that there might be a need to have a broader base of allies from which to kind of draw towards some of this work. So King's realizing that there's this impatience and desire for violent retaliation in this rise of black nationalism and militarism, but he's also struggling with his own disappointment and disillusionment in the gradualist approach that he's come to accept is the main approach of white churches to the civil rights movement, what he terms the white moderate. people who may have supported the aims of the civil rights movement, but were also trying to maintain some semblance of the status quo, and some semblance of, keeping society as it is while slowly trying to bring in a little bit of justice, a little bit more rights, a little bit more this, so that everything doesn't change so dramatically. King's been willing to be a bit more, slow on things, up to this point, but he's coming to where he's losing his own patience as well. And again, there's the background of his sort of radical sort of movement towards more of a much wider attack on racism and poverty and militarism at the root of American society. So again, all this stuff going on, and he's starting to try to make these arguments that there needs to be significant and foundational changes to the structures and systems of society. And in the letter, you see some of how he makes that argument. Now, most of the letter is really kind of hitting at his disappointment in the moderation and caution of some liberal white churches. In many ways, the letter from Birmingham jail is a call for a Christianity that is as radical as Jesus himself was. It is a sort of laying down a sort of a flag of saying we cannot keep accepting this gradualist way of doing things. If you're going to be our allies, you white moderates, you absolutely must start really digging down and making some uncomfortable statements and start to make some actual real change. He really calls out many of his white liberal allies, and it causes a significant amount of consternation and controversy in the sort of the community that he brought into a coalition by this point. Now, I really want you to key in and note that King is actually, you can hear it in his voice here. He is quite disappointed in the Christian church in general when it is sort of moderate and cautious, because he insists that a church that does not have a radical social witness in the light of great injustice is actually failing to uphold the charge and responsibility that he states Jesus granted, gave the church when he established the church, when he was, sort of doing his work 2,000 years ago. King points to the lack of a radical witness as one of the reasons, actually, not only why many Christians leave the church, but also why many black people do not trust white allies. This is the first time he's really kind of calling out his white allies, saying you have to actually step up. You have to make a point of being involved and engaged. On a related note, these passages are often cited whenever Christians with a strong focus on peacemaking and fighting injustice critique moderation in the church. This is a conflict that still rages within Christianity today, as could be witnessed actually in the conflicting responses of Christian churches to the Black Lives Matter movement most recently, and the significant sort of social movement that was sort of unleashed in the summer of 2020 with the death of George Floyd and all of the protests that emerged from that. That if you look at the language of how Christians were talking with amongst themselves about the movement, and about the response of the Christian church to the movement, you can see this sort of this frustration and anger with more moderate approaches. Now, fast forward 4 years, and a lot has happened in 4 years. Dramatic amounts has happened in 4 years. When you have A Time to Break Silence, King delivers this sermon April 4th, 1967. It should be noted because it is it's not just coincidental that it happens, that he gives this sermon 1 year before he's assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. Now, this sermon, A Time to Break Silence, is also known as the Riverside Church Sermon because it was delivered in Riverside Church, which is a large church in Manhattan that has been known for its entire existence as a place of progressive causes. Abolition was, had many adherents. Members of the Riverside Church were very involved in that work. The first sort of movement of sort of the social gospel and Christians being involved in penal reform and in anti-poverty work in the instead of the Victorian time. They're rooted in Riverside Church. So he goes to this one church to make his very first real prominent statement about how he feels about the war in Vietnam. He'd always been sort of seen as just, at some level, that civil rights preacher. Except he always had made this claim, this insistence that, you need to pay attention to the intersectionality of racism and poverty, and how militarism and how the American military system kind of feeds on racism and poverty, not only in just sort of the consistency of an inordinate proportion of recruits to the U.S. military coming from places of poverty, as well as there being a higher percentage in the lower ranks of the U.S. military of people of color than you'd find in the general population. So he's always had this sort of as a statement, because he is a Christian nonviolent preacher. He is not a fan of U.S. military action, but he'd been really insisting on focusing mainly on questions of civil rights. Now, as we talked about in the Beloved Community lecture, we see the peace movement around 1965 start to sort of peel away white support especially, for the civil rights movement, because it's moving towards sort of pushing against and critiquing the war in Vietnam as it starts to ramp up. So King had never really been involved in that, but he made this statement, the sermon, where he says explicitly, by this point, in 1967, there's been a decade plus of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, quietly for the first few years, and then ramping up with John F. Kennedy's administration, and then incredible amounts of increasing with Lyndon B. LBJ's administration. So 1967 is this time when the peace movement is really starting to hit its stride. And he is King in this sermon. He lays out his framework for understanding how these three evils, racism, poverty, and militarism, all intersect and all kind of are bound up in the oppressive structure of U.S. society, and specifically how you cannot look at the racism inherent in northern cities and in all of the economic segregation that you see in northern cities, along with the political and social segregation you see, and economic, you see in the South, and that connected with racism and how that's connected and overlaid with poverty. You cannot understand that without also understanding U.S. Militarism. There's a famous quote where he talks about, I'm going to butcher it, but basically bombs that go off in Vietnam also go off in the inner cities, that they are inextricably linked. that the impact of the Vietnam War is felt extraordinarily more in communities of color because of high rates of poverty and because of high rates of people of color being drafted into the war. He's saying that Vietnam is inherently a civil rights question. But then he makes another turn, and that's where it starts really getting controversial for King, in that he explicitly states that the war effectively is itself evil. Now, again, he's been preaching nonviolence for years. This isn't anything new, but when he specifically attacks the American military and says that it itself is doing something that is wrong and evil, and he starts pulling in all of this this talk of solidarity with North Korea, the sermon itself actually allows there to be the potential for an empathetic response, and that Christians must have an empathetic response, not sort of agreeing with, but an empathetic, meaning understanding where they're coming from, an empathetic response to North Korea, and an empathetic response to the Viet Cong, which are communist supporters within South Vietnam. Sorry, this is not Korea. North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And this fact that he starts actually saying that there's the potential for humanity amongst these people, and that he sort of says, well, maybe there might be a Christian response to communism that isn't inherently, let's just bomb them into the Stone Ages. This loses King a significant amount of support because he's hitting at, again, this radical question, this root question, the foundation of how poverty, racism, and militarism are all intersected. Now, when we move on to the Drum Major Instinct, this is delivered in February of 1968. This is mere months, literally 2 months before he's killed. And what is really interesting about this sermon is that it is actually just it's a sermon. He's preaching in connection to a text talking about the disciples of Jesus who want to be important and want to be at his right hand and his left hand when he comes into his glory, basically when he's resurrected into heaven. And he, of course, notes, ironically, that in order to be at Jesus' right hand and left hand, they must, these disciples must actually be crucified themselves and must die themselves and must go through this torture themselves. So they don't really know what they're asking for. But he keys in on this question, and he uses a really interesting way to kind of expand upon this whole other question of power and of ego, and how that somehow has really led to the development of white supremacy. He makes this argument where he starts sort of saying that at some level white supremacy is itself emerging from this natural human impulse that everyone possesses to be important, to be seen as important. But then he says that it gets twisted into this entire system of structural oppression. Now, interestingly enough, you can really note that a lot of the arguments made in the South to defend the South in the Civil War are not related to the question of of slavery and saving slavery for the whole society per se, because not everyone in the South before pre-Civil War, antebellum, actually has slaves. The vast majority do not. Slavery is an economic system that most poor people in the South just don't have the money to access. But it's sold to them as a way of ensuring that they are still superior, that they might be poor, but at least they're connected to other white people through this sort of sense of superiority, a sense of connection of race superiority. So he says that, the inherent class consciousness of poor white people should be with poor black people. They should see themselves as similar because they're both being exploited by the elites at the top of the system. But he says that never gets translated, and it never really, except for a few different communities here and there, it never really translates wider, where, race will always overcome class consciousness. Race will always overcome economic consciousness. And that is connected in his eyes to this drum major instinct, which this idea of ego, this idea of importance, which gets pushed into this white supremacist stew. And then you see this whole question of white supremacy emerge from that, in that you have, people who firmly should be supporting black people, but don't, purely because of the fact that they feel like, at some level, they are supreme, they are better than other people. Now, I'm not sure about, if you can boil down white supremacy just to this, this idea of supremacy and importance and ego, but King makes a really fascinating point, and he starts hitting at some really core radical issues where we're looking at class. King is taking on class and taking on economic oppression and saying you have to take this seriously. White people, you have to pay attention to how you're being manipulated. He's saying that the society generally must take account of how elites manipulate those in positions of lesser power. In many ways, this is really a power question. This is sort of, as at some level, it can seen as quite a socialist argument for King, because he's saying that economics, as opposed to race, should be a more important sort of designation of connection and interconnection between people. Now, some questions emerge from this. One, does this resonate with any contemporary situation that we're dealing with right now? And I would say, well, obviously, yes. You're going to find a great amount of the current movement, the current challenge of white nationalism and white supremacism. In many ways, it's pretty easy to see the connection between what King is talking about in '68 all the way over to what's going on in the rise of white supremacism in certain contexts of American society in 2020, 2021. Another sort of key element here that he really pushes on is this question of drum major for righteousness. He flips it at the end. He says that if we're going to be drum majors, if we want to be important, what should we be drum majors for? And he's saying that this is something which can be healed. He's sort of pointing forward to how can we bring people back from white supremacy? How can we use the natural human ego and need for importance? Can we flip that around somehow in a way that's going to be healing and that's going to be helpful? Now, he roots this in this idea of intent. What actually is what's different between a drum major for righteousness and a drum major for white supremacy? And at some level, he roots this in intent. What is the intent here? The drum major for righteousness, the intent is to be rooted in God, rooted in, specifically Jesus Christ, rooted in that the witness of Jesus and the testimony of who Jesus was, which, if you're rooting in the divine, you're rooting it in something which is inherently bigger than you. so it's inherently going to be, humbling. And also because if you're rooting it in, the Christian divine purpose, then you're rooting it in something which is inherently righteous. Whereas the drum major for white supremacy is rooted in something which is inherently human, inherently unjust, and inherently ego-driven. But at core, he says the only way to really make this work is to be focusing on the question of love. This is where people kind of lose King, or King loses his audience, because people kind of dismiss it as, oh, well, it's high, who cares? That's airy-fairy. But he says you cannot understand King. In many ways, you really can't understand Christian peacemaking and the sort of civil rights movement that's happening in the U.S. On a Christian side of things without understanding the overwhelming power and the overwhelming influence of this idea of love as not only a potent but the most potent force for social change. King is only referring to a wider Christian concept, which is you can find in much of the New Testament, especially the first, second, and third letters of John, where John literally says straight out, states it explicitly, God is love. And that you also see that in the Gospel of John, where he says that God is actually love. Inherently, at core, the divine is love. So in order to be connected to the divine, in order to sort of, reflect Jesus and Jesus' witness, you must love. And that love is going to be this potent force that's going to drive your desire for change. And if you're connected to that love, it's going to give you a greater ability to make more substantial change because you're going to be driven by that sense of love. And that's really what drives King's work, and is what drives the wider, framework of Christian social justice movements in general, is this undercurrent, this foundational, this radical idea that at core, God is about love. And that love of God for creation, insists upon, trying to have equality for all, justice for all, insists upon a justice coupled with mercy. So Christian sort of, peacemaking is going to look different from potentially other, peacemaking in other settings because of that idea of, bringing in that idea of love. That's King's argument at core. And you can see this sort of track its way through these three pieces. And you can see this idea consistently bringing up in different ways. This intersection of poverty and, the oppressive systems and structures of poverty in the U.S., racism, how that's linked in with that, and the insistence on militarism and U.S. Military might and ego, and how that sort of plays as well in all of it.